When young people have mental health issues, it seriously affects their ability to learn. It can be for a number of reasons. It could be because they are so preoccupied with the thoughts of their illness, and maybe they haven't shared those thoughts with anybody yet, so they're afraid, they're worried and they're concerned. It can be because they're so distracted by their thoughts. These voices in their heads may be overwhelming, whether it's about anorexia or some sort of other mental health problem. It completely drowns out everything else that they're trying to access whilst they're in lessons and lectures. And also with some of these illnesses, they can actually damage young people cognitively. It affects their ability to process information. It's very sad when I get young people coming in to this hospital and I do an initial education meeting with them, ask them what their favourite subjects are and how they think they're going to achieve. And I'd love £1 for every time a young person says, "I used to be clever." So our aim is to make them see that by the time they leave here, that their cognitions come back to them and they get back to being who they were before. I think the one word I would use if you wanted to know how a school could support young people with mental health would be to have a plan and to liaise closely with the young person, their family and any support they're getting in the community. If you don't have a cohesive plan that everybody is aware of and everybody has agreed to, then the communication very rapidly breaks down, and it has to come through communication both on a family level with the young person and then with the staff who are actually going to see the young person on a day-to-day basis. We get very positive responses a lot of the time from schools, but the people that we tend to as professionals be talking to are the senior management. And then when I go into schools and colleges to see how things are going, the actual people who are at the chalk front, as it were, haven't received this information and support. So planning, liaison and communication. When you're looking for signs, or you suddenly notice signs of behaviour in a young person that's not normal, then I think teachers all should be trained to know that sometimes these can be an indicator of mental health problems. Obviously it could be social problems, etc. But on the whole, looking back at my time as a mainstream teacher, I do have periods of great unrest when looking back I can see actually what I was seeing as poor behaviour in a young person I used to teach was actually the start of mental health problems, or at least the start of their not being able to cover the signs and symptoms of their mental health problems. So basically, if I go into schools now, what I advise teachers and LSAs and the management team to look out for a radical change in this young person. Why is so-and-so suddenly behaving like this when they didn't before? Looking for a drop in their grades, poor attendance at lessons, even coming to school. A lot of young people we find have been going to school, so they're marked as present, but they're spending most of their time in the loos or in some other room because they can't face the issues that happen in the crowds of a classroom. So if something is different, it might be easier for a teacher to see than a parent, say, who sees the child every day. They might have their best friends know about it, and I think this is something that should be covered in PDL lessons, you know, how to help your friends, because we all know that young people swear their friends to secrecy, but that's not actually helpful. So training them to have permission to seek help if they're worried. And I think schools are more likely to see signs and symptoms before people that know a young person on a day-to-day basis will see them. Familiarity breeds contempt with this sort of thing. We don't see the decline when we know a young person too well. As a mainstream teacher for 20 years, I have huge empathy. Teaching in a classroom is a relentless job. You know, 30 young people come in, 30 go out, and so that process repeats all day and every day. And it is a big ask to ask teachers who are teaching daily to be aware of the emotional well-being of the young people. What I think they need to do is have their own emotional well-being, which makes us a lot more mindful about what can go wrong. Teachers in particular are very good at not paying attention to their own emotional needs. Right? We're particularly poor at it. We don't analyse things, we deal with it and we move on. And I think when you've been teaching long enough, you learn to do that in your own life as well. I think senior management have a real requirement to ensure that their staff have time for reflection have time to deal with things when they go terribly wrong at school. As teachers, you don't. Everybody looks after the children and their families when there's been some emotional fallout. We don't look after the teachers. So I think the message is to go to the senior management team and start looking after your staff, and then they in turn will have the literacy, the emotional literacy, to support their young people better. Schools' reluctance to support mental health, I know, comes from ignorance, fear and lack of education, and sometimes guilt. The most aggressive teacher I have seen at a meeting for a young person who had mental health issues, she finally, having been quite rude and abrasive with the hospital staff and with myself, afterwards collapsed in a heap, and she was racked with guilt that she hadn't noticed how unwell this child was, and he was in her group and she had moral and legal responsibility for him as she saw it, and she was absolutely devastated. That is something that we never want to see happen and shouldn't see happen. I mean, until you're trained to see these things, you deal with teenagers and you tend to think it's poor behaviour. That's our go-to place as teachers. And you get parents in to talk about behaviour, and then the parent gets cross. This reluctance for schools to face the issues of mental health and the issues that it brings for the young people in school, it needs education from the top down. So teachers need to be trained. The management need to take on their legal requirement now with the new statutory obligation to ensure that education is appropriate for young people with mental health issues. Everyone is going to have to look at this, and they're going to have to make inquiries about how they get funding to support these young people. But it's like talking about cancer was 15 years ago. Nobody wants to say it, and that comes from not knowing and not understanding. And this needs to be a big educational push, both at the young person's levels, PDL lessons, assemblies, and also for the management team to ensure the messages and the training get down to the teachers who are in the classroom. I think if I had one last message for helping schools and colleges to manage the welfare of these young people and help support them, I would ask that you would look very, very carefully to what support you can get from the outside. It is meant to be improving in the community for young people. There is meant to be more help out there rather than young people have to come in to inpatient provisions. There are very few of such hospitals anyway, but even if a young person comes here, we don't want them to be in such places for very long, because you need to stay with your family, you need to stay in your school or your college. But colleges are going to have to look out and start demanding. I've recently been into schools who are very keen to have a young person back, want to support them to the best of their ability, are very aware of their legal obligations to help these young people, but they have got no support in terms of funding. They cannot get enough LSAs. Statementing procedure doesn't cover the help that these young people need, and I think schools need to get more proactive. So management teams need to go out, they need to start making demands, and they need to realise that actually up to 10% of the young people could have mental health issues at any one time, and this is a population that deserves as much help and support as any other child in their school, but we're going to have to work harder to get it for them. The Accede initiative is something that's really exciting and new. It's obviously so new to me that when I first heard about it from Young Minds, I had to go and look it up on the internet, and there is just so little information out there for young people and anybody else that needs information about mental health issues. So I think it's been a long time coming, and it's very much needed and will be well used.